Hello, and welcome. I'm glad you are here tonight. There's something I want to share with you, something written down 5,000 years ago in a language that had to be rediscovered, translated from symbols pressed into clay by hands we'll never know. These aren't stories about gods the way we usually think of myths. These are the oldest written stories in human history, and they describe something particular. A conflict, a war, not between human kings, but between beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Tonight, we're going to look at what those ancient texts actually say. By the way, where are you listening from right now? What does the night feel like where you are? Is it quiet? Can you hear anything beyond this voice? The hum of a distant road? The settling of a house around you? You're here, in this moment, and we're about to reach back across 50 centuries to touch something that should have been lost forever. Clay tablets buried under Iraqi desert sand, libraries from cities whose names most people have never heard, but somehow they survived. And when scholars finally learned to read them again in the 1800s, they found something unexpected. Not just lists and record keeping, not just songs and prayers, but detailed stories about beings from the sky, their conflicts with each other, their relationship with humanity, and a final destructive war that the texts describe with troubling detail. The Anunnaki, that's what the Sumerians called them. The name appears again and again in the oldest writings we have. Those who from heaven to earth came, not a symbol, not poetic language. The texts treat them as physical beings, with ranks and territories and appetites, who shaped the early world and then, according to these same ancient sources, fought a war that tore everything apart. If you find these explorations meaningful, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it. That's all. Now, settle in, let your breathing slow. Feel whatever warmth surrounds you. We have hours ahead, and there's no hurry, none at all. Tonight we travel to southern Mesopotamia, to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where writing was invented, and where the first cities rose from the marshlands. We're going to move slowly through what archaeologists found, through the actual tablets and what they contain, through the stories of gatherings in heaven and wars between gods and weapons that sound. Well, you'll see what they sound like. We'll encounter kings who supposedly ruled for 30,000 years, floods sent on purpose by the gods who regretted creating humanity, and descriptions of destruction that trouble modern readers precisely because they're so detailed, so specific, so strangely technical for texts written in 2600 BCE. But we're not here to draw conclusions. We're here to listen, to wonder, to hold these ancient words carefully, the way you might hold something fragile and precious, and let them speak for themselves. The Sumerians lived in a world we can barely imagine, and yet they wrote things down. They pressed their thoughts into wet clay with cut reeds, fired the tablets, stored them in temple libraries. They wanted us to know. They wanted the future, wanted us to remember what they remembered. So, let's begin. Let's go back to the very beginning. Before the tablets, before the writing, before even the Sumerians themselves. Let's go back to when the land itself was being born, long before any city rose from the dust, long before the first temple was built, or the first god named. This land breathed differently. The air tasted of cold, not heat. The horizon, where now the desert stretches endlessly under a merciless sun, was once something else entirely. We need to go back, way back, to a time 12,000 years ago, when the world was just emerging from the grip of an ice age that had held the planet frozen for 100,000 years. The glaciers were melting, slowly at first, then faster. Ice sheets that had covered half of Europe, half of North America, turning to water, flowing toward the seas, raising the ocean levels foot by foot, year by year, generation by generation. The Persian Gulf, that body of water that today separates Iran from Saudi Arabia, didn't exist in the form we know. Not yet. During the Ice Age, when so much water was locked in ice, sea levels were 300 feet lower than they are now. 300 feet. The Gulf was a river valley, a green corridor, and at its northern end, where the Tigris and Euphrates flowed together, there was dry land stretching for hundreds of miles beyond the current coastline. But the ice was melting, and the water was rising. Imagine standing on that ancient coast. Perhaps 15,000 years ago, you're watching the sea creep closer, not in a day, not in a year, but over lifetimes. Your grandfather tells you the sea was farther out when he was young. Your father shows you markers, stones placed at the waterline when he was a boy, now submerged. And you notice it too. The marsh is growing. The land your family has known, hunted over, gathered from, is slowly disappearing beneath the rising tide. This is the world being born, the world where the Sumerians will eventually tell their stories. But that's still 8,000 years away. The water keeps rising, keeps pushing inland, the Tigris and Euphrates, which during the Ice Age carved deep channels through exposed rock, now find their paths slowing, spreading, flooding. Where there was solid ground, there are now marshes. Where there were hills, there are now islands. The rivers dump their sediment, building up the delta, even as the sea pushes up from the south. The climate is changing too, as the ice retreats, as the world warms. The weather patterns shift. This region, which was cold and dry during the glacial maximum, becomes warmer, wetter. The rains come more reliably. Grasses spread across the plains. Trees find purchase along the riverbanks. Animals follow the green, and humans follow the animals. This is not yet Mesopotamia, not yet the land between the rivers that the Greeks will name thousands of years later. This is still unnamed, still wild, still forming. Perhaps, on clear nights, people camped by those ancient rivers looked up at the same stars we see tonight, the same constellations wheeling overhead, Orion rising in winter, the Pleiades clustering like distant campfires. They had no writing to record what they saw, no cities to contain them, but they had eyes, they had wonder, and they watched the sky just as we do. By 10,000 years ago, the sea has pushed far inland. The southern tip of Mesopotamia, the region that will become Sumer, is mostly marsh and shallow water. The Bakun, Persian Gulf, has filled its basin. The coastline has moved 200 miles north from where it was during the Ice Age. Whole landscapes have drowned. Valleys have become bays. Hills have become islands. And in this newborn landscape of water and reeds, something begins to happen. People start to settle, not just camping for a season, but staying, building permanent homes. The marshes are rich with life. Fish, waterfowl, reeds for building, clay for pottery, and between the marsh and the desert, there's soil deposited by the flooding rivers. Soil that, if you can manage the water, will grow almost anything. The same rising seas that drowned the old coastlines have created something new. A fertile, waterlogged, impossibly productive environment. It won't be easy to live here. The floods come irregularly. Too much water one year, too little the next. But for people willing to dig channels, to build levees, to wrestle with the rivers, this place offers abundance, maybe the stories of a great flood. The ones that the Sumerians will write down 4,000 years from now. Maybe they carry some distant memory of this, of the time when the seas rose and the old world drowned, when coastlines moved and river valleys filled and everything changed. It's just speculation, of course, but the timing aligns. The geological record shows it clearly. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf transformed completely. And oral traditions can last a long time, longer than we usually imagine. Australian Aboriginal stories describe coastlines that drowned 10,000 years ago, and the stories preserve accurate details. Could the Sumerians have retained some cultural memory of the drowning of the Gulf? We don't know. We can't know. But it's worth wondering about as we think about where their flood stories came from. By 8,000 years ago, the marshlands are fully formed. The sea level has nearly reached its modern height. The Tigris and Euphrates have settled into their courses. The stage is set. And onto this stage, into these marshes and along these rivers, come the people who will build the first permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia. They have no writing yet, no cities, no kings, but they're about to begin something that will change human history forever. The sun rises over the marshes, casting long shadows through the reeds. The water reflects the sky like hammered bronze, and somewhere along the edge of the marsh, on a slight rise where the land stays dry even when the rivers flood, someone is building a house, not a tent, not a temporary shelter, a house. We're in the year 6500 BCE now, 8,500 years ago. The people living in southern Mesopotamia have a culture that archaeologists call Ubaid. They're named after a site called Tel al-Ubaid, discovered in the 1920s, where the remains of these earliest permanent settlers were first recognized. The Ubaid people are not yet the Sumerians. They come before. They're the foundation, the roots. But we know remarkably little about them, because they left no writing. Everything we know comes from what they built, what they made, what they left behind in the ground. And what they left behind is strange. The houses first. They build with what's available. Reed bundles tied together and bent into arches. Mud brick made from the river clay. The structures are simple but well made. They last. They're built to stay. And that decision, to stop moving, to commit to one place, that's revolutionary. Because once you settle down, everything changes. You can't take everything with you when you move. So you make better pottery, heavier, more durable. The Ubaid people become master potters. Their ceramics are beautiful, decorated with geometric patterns and dark paint on pale clay. Curves and lines and dots that seem almost modern, almost abstract. But it's the figurines that unsettle people, small clay figures found in graves and in temple platforms, human-shaped, but not quite human. They have elongated heads, large, almond-shaped eyes, slender bodies. Some have what look like shoulder pads or strange protrusions. They're often shown holding babies, or with their arms crossed over their chests. Hundreds have been found across Ubaid sites. What are they? Who do they represent? The standard answer is that they're religious figures, goddesses, maybe spirits, symbolic representations of something. But we don't know. We have no texts to explain them, just these strange, alien-looking figures staring at us across 8,000 years. Maybe they're just stylized art. Maybe elongated heads were considered beautiful. Maybe the large eyes were symbolic. But when you see them in a museum, when you look at dozens of them together, there's something undeniably odd about them. They don't look like any other ancient art, and the Ubaid people are doing something else too, something that will echo through Mesopotamian history. They're building temple platforms. At Eridu, one of the oldest sites, archaeologists have found a sequence of temples built one on top of another. The earliest is tiny, just a small room on a platform, but over centuries, over thousands of years, each generation rebuilds it, makes it bigger, raises the platform higher. By the time the Sumerians arrive, there are 17 layers of temples stacked like a layer cake, each one built on the ruins of the last. This matters because it shows continuity, shows that the same site was considered sacred for thousands of years, shows that the Sumerians, when they eventually appear, are building on something older. They inherit a landscape already marked by holy places, already shaped by generations of devotion. The Ubaid period lasts for almost 3,000 years, from 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. That's longer than all of recorded history, longer than the entire span from the first Egyptian pyramid to today. And during all that time, these people are living in the marshes, farming the riverbanks, building their temples, making their strange figurines. But they never develop writing, never build cities, never create what we would call civilization. They stay at the edge of that threshold. Permanent villages? Yes. Sophisticated culture? Yes. But not yet writing, not yet urbanism. Perhaps they're content. Perhaps their way of life works well enough that there's no pressure to change. The marshes provide fish and fowl. The rivers provide water and transport. The soil, when the floods cooperate, provides grain. Maybe they have stories. Maybe they have gods. Surely they watch the stars, track the seasons, pass down knowledge from grandparents to grandchildren. But without writing, their voices are silent. We can see what they made, but we can't hear what they said, can't know what they believed, can't read their version of events. At night, above the marsh, the stars wheel slowly. Orion sets in the west. The Milky Way stretches like a river of light. And in the temples on their low platforms, perhaps priests or priestesses keep watch. Perhaps they track the movements of Venus. Perhaps they notice that certain stars return at the same time the floods come. Perhaps they're already beginning the observations that will, thousands of years later, become Sumerian astronomy. But this is all speculation. All perhaps, all maybe. What we know for certain is that around 4000 BCE, something changes. The Ubaid culture fades, new people arrive, or maybe the old people transform. The settlements grow larger, more complex. The first real towns appear. Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Eridu expanding on its ancient foundations. And within a few centuries, writing appears. The silence is about to break. There's a gap, a strange, exciting gap in what we can know. Between 4000 BCE and 3200 BCE, something extraordinary is happening in southern Mesopotamia. We can see it in the archaeological record. Settlements exploding in size, towns becoming cities, populations growing, trade networks extending hundreds of miles, complex social organization developing, specialized crafts, monumental architecture, but no writing, not yet. So we can see what they built, but we can't hear them speak. Uruk is growing into something unprecedented. By 3500 BCE, it's a city, a real city. Maybe 10,000 people living there, maybe more. Mud brick buildings packed together, narrow streets, workshops making pottery and tools and textiles. And at the center, a massive temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna. The temple platform rises 40 feet above the surrounding plain. It's built from millions of mud bricks, each one made by hand, dried in the sun, laid in courses. The labor required is staggering. Thousands of workers, years of effort, all directed toward creating a home for the goddess. This is not the work of scattered villagers. This is organized, centralized. Someone is planning this. Someone is commanding the labor. Someone is distributing food to the workers. And that someone, we assume, is claiming authority from the gods themselves. But we don't know their names, don't know their titles, don't know what they said to convince people to break their backs carrying bricks. Because they haven't written it down yet. The same pattern appears at other sites. Eridu, Nippur, all growing, all building temples, all developing complex social structures, and all, for a few more centuries, silent. What stories are being told during these years? What myths are circulating? When priests stand on those high temple platforms at night, watching the stars, tracking the movements of the moon and planets, what do they say those lights are? Do they already have names for the gods? Do they already tell stories about Enlil and Enki and Inanna? Do they already speak of the Anunnaki? Maybe, probably. Oral traditions usually precede written ones by centuries. The Iliad and the Odyssey were recited for generations before someone wrote them down. The same is likely true here. The stories that will eventually be pressed into clay tablets, they're probably already being told, already being refined, already traveling from city to city. But without the writing, they could change, shift, transform with each telling. That's how oral traditions work. They're living, flexible. They adapt to new circumstances, new politics, new needs. A story told in Uruk might be different from the same story told in Ur. A story told during a good harvest might emphasize different elements than one told during a drought. Perhaps the gods are being shaped during these years. The theology being worked out. The relationships between deities being negotiated. Maybe different cities champion different gods. Maybe there's competition. Maybe the priests of Enlil in Nippur tell different stories than the priests of Enki in Eridu. And maybe, just maybe, they're drawing on even older memories, on stories passed down from the Ubaid people, on tales from before the floods, on fragments of something more ancient that we can never recover. The night sky hasn't changed. The stars turn in their eternal dance. Venus rises before dawn, bright enough to cast shadows. Jupiter moves slowly through the constellations. The moon waxes and wanes. People have been watching this for thousands of years, tracking it, learning its patterns, and in those patterns, finding order, finding meaning, finding gods. By 3300 BCE, Uruk is enormous, perhaps 30,000 people, perhaps more. It's the largest city in the world. The temple complex has grown into a massive enclosure with multiple buildings. The goddess Inanna presides over everything, and the city needs to manage itself. Trade goods are flowing in, grain is being stored, workers need to be fed, craftsmen need to be paid, debts need to be tracked, property needs to be recorded. The complexity has reached a point where memory alone isn't enough. Someone needs to write things down. And so, around 3200 BCE, in Uruk, someone does. The first tablets are simple: clay tokens pressed with a stick, marks representing numbers, pictures representing objects, grain, sheep, beer. It's accounting, record keeping. Nothing more, but it's a beginning. Within a few generations, the system expands. The pictures become more abstract. More symbols appear. The marks start to represent sounds, not just objects. Language is being captured. Thought is being frozen in clay. And within a few more centuries, someone uses this new technology to write down something other than a receipt. Someone writes a prayer. Someone writes a hymn. Someone writes a story. And that story, one of the first stories ever written, is about the gods, about their deeds, their conflicts, their relationship with humanity, about the Anunnaki. The silence breaks, and the voice that emerges, the first voice that speaks to us directly across the millennia, tells us about beings from the sky, about cosmic assemblies, about the creation of humans, and eventually about a war. Picture a room somewhere in Uruk. The year is around 3200 BCE, 5,200 years ago. The air is hot, dust floating in shafts of sunlight through a small window. A man sits on the floor with a flat piece of clay in front of him, soft and moist, freshly mixed. In his hand, he holds a cut reed. The tip is shaped into a wedge. He's counting jars of oil. Someone has delivered them to the temple. The goddess must be paid her due. The priests need records and memory. Even the best memory can fail. So he presses the reed into the clay. A mark, another mark, another, circles for the jars, lines for the numbers, simple, clear. When the clay dries, when it's baked hard in the sun, it will last. It will be proof, evidence, a record that cannot be argued with. He doesn't know he's inventing writing. He's just solving a problem. But that's how it begins. The earliest tablets from Uruk are almost disappointing in their mundanity. Grain deliveries, beer rations, sheep counts. Lists of names we can't pronounce beside numbers we can barely interpret. This is not poetry, not literature, not even complete sentences, just information, frozen in clay. But the system spreads. Other cities adopt it. Other scribes find uses for it. And within a few generations, the marks become more sophisticated. They start to represent not just objects, but sounds, syllables, the beginnings of actual written language. By 2900 BCE, about 3 centuries after those first accounting tablets, the script has evolved. It's still pictures, still symbols, but now they can capture speech, can preserve words, can record prayers and dedications. The tablets found from this period show something new appearing alongside the receipts and inventories. Short inscriptions on statues, dedications on temple walls, the names of gods. And then, around 2600 BCE, something remarkable happens. Someone sits down and writes a story, not a list, not an account, a narrative, and it survives. Multiple copies of it survive. Passed down through generations of scribes who considered it important enough to copy and preserve. We call it the Instructions of Shurupak. It's a text in which a father gives wisdom to his son. Do not steal, do not murder, do not speak falsely. Simple moral teachings. But it's written as continuous text, complete sentences, a voice speaking across time. And around the same period, the first references to the Anunnaki appear in writing. Not detailed narratives yet, just mentions, acknowledgments. The Anunnaki are invoked in temple dedications. They're named in blessing formulas. They're present in the written consciousness of Sumer as something everyone knows about, as something that doesn't need explanation. The writers assume their readers understand who the Anunnaki are. This tells us something important. The Anunnaki aren't being introduced in these early texts. They're already established, already part of the cultural fabric, which means the stories about them, the myths, the cosmology, all of that predates the writing. It was already there, already being told orally. For how long? Centuries? Millennia? We can't know. The script itself becomes more standardized during these years. The pictures become more abstract, more cuneiform, literally wedge-shaped. Each character is built from combinations of wedge marks, different angles, different lengths. It's efficient, faster to write than drawing pictures, and it can capture the sound of the language more precisely. By 2500 BCE, we start to get longer texts, hymns to gods, descriptions of temple construction, and the first fragments of what will become the great Sumerian epics, stories about Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk who sought immortality, stories about Inanna descending to the underworld, and stories about the Anunnaki, about their hierarchy, about their roles in creation. These tablets are small. Most fit in your hand. The clay is smooth, almost silky when it's fresh. The wedge marks press into it cleanly, each stroke deliberate. When you look at actual cuneiform tablets in museums, run your eyes over the tiny, precise marks. There's something intimate about them. Someone's hand made these impressions. Someone's mind chose these words 5,000 years ago. But the clay remembers. The scribes who write these tablets go through years of training. Scribal schools are established in the major cities. Young boys, probably from elite families, spend years learning the script, copying standard texts, memorizing character combinations, practicing until their hand is steady and their marks are uniform. And what they copy, what they're taught, includes the stories of the gods, the myths of creation, the tales of the Anunnaki. This is considered essential knowledge, part of the curriculum. These aren't fringe beliefs or folk tales. This is the official cosmology, the established narrative of how the world came to be. Perhaps, when a scribe copies a tablet describing how Enki created humans from clay, he pauses, looks at his own hands, wonders about the parallel. He's shaping clay too, giving it form, making it speak. Is there something divine in that act? Something that echoes the creation itself? We don't know what they thought while they worked, but the tablets themselves reveal care, precision, reverence for the texts they're preserving. These aren't casual documents. They matter. By 2400 BCE, we have substantial literary works. The Sumerian language is fully captured in cuneiform, and the tablets coming from this period include detailed descriptions of the Anunnaki pantheon. Who's in charge? Of what? Which gods govern which domains? The whole cosmic bureaucracy laid out clearly, and here's what's striking. These texts don't treat the Anunnaki as metaphors, don't frame them as symbolic representations of natural forces. They describe them as beings, physical beings, with bodies, with appetites, with conflicts and alliances. They eat, they drink, they get angry, they fall in love, they go to war. The tablets describe meetings of the divine council, debates among the gods, decisions made in assemblies, laws proclaimed from heaven, and humanity, according to these texts, created specifically to serve the Anunnaki, to do the work the lesser gods refused to do. This is the story the Sumerians tell about themselves, about their place in the cosmos, and they write it down with the same matter-of-fact tone they use for recording grain shipments. This is just how things are. The stars wheel overhead, night after night, as they always have. The scribes look up at them, track them, notice that some move and some don't. Notice the patterns, and they write that down too. Star lists, astronomical observations, the movements of Venus carefully recorded, because the gods are associated with celestial bodies. The sky is where they dwell, and understanding the sky is understanding the gods. We're still centuries away from the texts that will describe the final war, the detailed narratives of conflict and catastrophe. But the foundation is being laid. The characters are being introduced. The cosmology is being established. The clay tablets multiply. Libraries form in the temples. Shelves of texts, thousands of them. Each one a voice speaking forward into time, hoping someone will listen. And someone does. Much, much later, after centuries of silence. The tablets sleep in the ground for a very long time. Sumer falls. Akkad rises and falls. Babylon rules and crumbles. Assyria conquers and collapses. The cities are abandoned. The temples crumble. The wind blows sand over everything. And the tablets, fired clay, nearly indestructible, lie buried under the accumulated debris of millennia, waiting. By the time of the Roman Empire, Sumer is completely forgotten. The name doesn't exist anymore. The language is dead. The script is unreadable. The cities are just mysterious mounds in the desert. Local people call them tells, Arabic for mounds, and mostly avoid them. They're just ruins, ancient. But from when? No one knows. The knowledge sleeps. The voices are silent. And then, in the 1800s, Europeans start digging. Let me tell you about a specific moment. A moment when everything changed. The year is 1849. The place is a tell called Kuyunjik, near the modern city of Mosul in Iraq. An Englishman named Austin Henry Layard is excavating here. He's already made discoveries, already found massive stone walls, colossal statues of human-headed bulls, carved reliefs showing battles and hunts. He knows he's found something important, an Assyrian palace, though even the word Assyria is barely understood at this point. But on this particular day, his workers break through into a room, and what they find stops them cold. The room is full of tablets, not hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. They cover the floor, pile against the walls, fill every space. Some are intact, many are broken, but all of them, every single one, is covered in those strange wedge-shaped marks. Layard doesn't know what they say. Nobody knows. The script is still a complete mystery. But he understands he's found a library, an ancient library, the biggest library anyone has ever discovered from the ancient world. He ships them to England, to the British Museum, crate after crate of clay tablets, 25,000 of them, some small enough to fit in your pocket, others the size of cushions, all covered in cuneiform, all silent. They sit in the museum. People look at them, wonder about them. But the script is locked, impenetrable, except scholars are working on it, have been working on it for decades. The breakthrough comes from Persia, from the cliffs at Behistun, where an ancient Persian king named Darius carved an inscription in 3 languages. One of those languages is Old Persian, which scholars can read because it's related to languages still spoken. And below the Persian text, the same inscription in cuneiform. It's like finding a Rosetta Stone. Same text, different scripts, and slowly, letter by letter, symbol by symbol, linguists begin to crack the code. By the 1850s, they can read basic Akkadian cuneiform. the language of Babylon and Assyria. It's hard work. The script is complex, but it's becoming readable. And then, in 1872, a man named George Smith is working in the British Museum. He's a young assistant, teaching himself cuneiform in his spare time. Not a trained scholar, just brilliantly curious. And he's going through Layard's tablets, translating them. And he finds something, a story, an epic. And in this epic, there's a flood. A man builds a boat, loads it with animals, survives while the rest of humanity drowns. And after the flood, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Smith realizes immediately what he's looking at. It's the story of Noah. But it's not from the Bible. It's older, much older. It's from an Assyrian epic, a Mesopotamian story that predates the biblical text by more than 1,000 years. The news explodes. Victorian England is scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. The biblical flood story, the foundation of so much religious belief, has a predecessor, a Babylonian original. What does this mean? Where did the Bible's version come from? But that's just the beginning, because as more tablets are translated, as more texts emerge from the ground, scholars realize the Assyrians and Babylonians didn't invent these stories either. They copied them from someone else, from the Sumerians. The deeper they dig, literally and figuratively, the older the sources become. Sites like Ur and Uruk and Nippur are excavated, and the tablets found there are in a different language, an older language, Sumerian, a language unrelated to anything spoken today, a language isolated, unique. And these Sumerian tablets, they're the originals, the source material, the stories the Babylonians copied, the myths the Assyrians preserved. They all come from Sumer. By the early 1900s, scholars are reading Sumerian. It's difficult. The language is strange. The grammar is unlike anything else. But slowly, text by text, the ancient voices start to speak again. And what they're saying is unexpected. They're describing gods, the Anunnaki, in very concrete terms, not as abstract cosmic forces, but as physical beings with specific roles and relationships. They're describing creation myths where humans are made to serve as laborers. They're describing conflicts among the gods, meetings, debates, decisions. And they're describing a flood sent deliberately, a decision made by the divine council, an attempt to wipe out humanity, with one god dissenting, warning a single human, allowing survival. The more texts that are translated, the more complex the picture becomes. This isn't simple mythology, it's an elaborate cosmology, a whole system of divine governance. And it's all written down as though it's historical fact. Perhaps the most unsettling thing for early translators is the tone. These texts don't read like parables or allegories. They read like chronicles, like records of events. The same tone used for documenting the building of a temple is used for describing the assembly of the gods. By the mid-20th century, thousands of tablets have been translated. Vast libraries of Sumerian literature are now accessible. Epic poems, hymns, lamentations, legal texts, agricultural manuals, and throughout all of it, woven through everything, are references to the Anunnaki. Some texts are fragmentary, broken tablets with crucial sections missing. Sometimes multiple copies exist, allowing scholars to piece together the full text. Sometimes there's just one tablet, damaged, incomplete, leaving tantalizing gaps. And among these texts, one in particular catches attention, a text that seems to describe warfare among the gods. Descriptions of weapons that sound wrong, too advanced, too specific. A text modern scholars will call the era epic. but we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's another text we need to look at first, one that challenges everything we think we understand about how ancient people recorded history. There's a tablet that makes people uncomfortable. It always has. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it's exactly what it sounds like. A list of kings who ruled Sumer, a chronological record, city by city, name by name. The kind of historical document every ancient civilization produces. Except this one is strange, very strange. The text survives in multiple copies, different versions found at different sites, but they all tell the same basic story, and they all agree on the most troubling details. The list begins like this. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, from heaven. The first thing we're told is that kingship, political authority, came from the sky. It was given, descended, bestowed by the gods, and then it names the first king, Alulim, and it tells us how long he ruled, 2800 years, not 28 years, not even 288 years, 28,800 years. The next king, Alalangar, ruled for 36 years. 5 kings in Eridu, total reign, 200 years. The kingship moves to another city, Bad Tibira. Another king reigns for 200 years. This goes on, name after name, city after city, kings ruling for tens of thousands of years. The list presents this information in the same matter-of-fact tone as a grocery. Receipt, no explanation, no apology, just the facts, as the Sumerians understood them. And then, after listing 8 kings who ruled for a combined total of 200 years, the text says something pivotal. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, everything changes. The reign lengths drop dramatically. Kings now rule for hundreds of years instead of thousands. Still impossibly long by our standards, but much shorter than before. Gilgamesh, the famous king of Uruk, is said to have ruled for 126 years. Still superhuman, but almost reasonable compared to what came before. And the further down the list you go, the shorter the reigns become. By the end, by the kings we can verify through archaeology, the reign lengths are normal, 20 years, 30 years, human lifespans. So what are we looking at? What is this document? Some scholars suggest it's purely mythological. The pre-flood kings are legendary figures, divine or semi-divine beings. The extreme reign. Lengths are symbolic, not meant to be taken literally. Perhaps they represent dynasties, not individuals. Perhaps the numbers encode some other meaning we don't understand. Others point out that many ancient cultures have similar traditions. The Egyptian pharaoh lists include gods who ruled before human kings. The Hebrew Bible describes people before the flood living for centuries. Methuselah supposedly lived 969 years. Maybe there's a common pattern here, a common way ancient people structured their understanding of deep time. But the Sumerian king list is unique in one respect. It doesn't separate myth from history. It presents one continuous sequence. From the first king who ruled 28,800 years, right down to kings we can verify, with no clear dividing line. It treats all of it as history. And here's what makes it more troubling. Some of the kings on the list are real. Archaeological evidence confirms them. We've found inscriptions with their names. We've found their tombs. We've excavated their palaces. The later part of the list aligns with verifiable history, which means the Sumerians considered the entire list to be historical. They didn't think they were mixing myth and fact. To them, it was all fact. All real kings who really ruled. So, either they were wrong, their oral traditions garbled over time, their chronology confused, or They were recording something in a way we don't understand, using numbers to encode information that isn't literal chronology. Perhaps the long rains represent periods of stability. Perhaps they reflect a different calendar system. Perhaps years meant something different in ancient Mesopotamia. Some scholars have tried to find patterns in the numbers, mathematical relationships that might reveal the true system. But no explanation has fully satisfied everyone. The king list remains anomalous, strange, a document that sits uncomfortably between mythology and history, and it explicitly connects kingship to heaven, to the Anunnaki. The divine council gave kingship to humanity, and for an impossibly long time, before the flood, things were different. Time worked differently, or people lived differently, or something we don't understand was happening. The flood itself is presented as a historical event. Then the flood swept over, stated as simply as, then the harvest came. It's a marker, a dividing line. Everything before the flood was one age. Everything after is another age. And this aligns with the flood narratives in other Sumerian texts. The story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, the story of Atrahasis. All these texts describe a flood sent by the gods, a deliberate decision, an attempt to reduce human population, and one man warned in advance. Building a boat, surviving. The geology confirms that massive flooding occurred in Mesopotamia. The region's rivers flood regularly, but there's evidence of catastrophic floods that inundated huge areas. Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, found an 8-foot thick layer of clean river clay. No artifacts, no occupation, just sterile clay. And below it, evidence of earlier civilization. He famously announced he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. Most scholars disagreed. The flood layers at different sites don't align chronologically. They represent different events, different local disasters. But still, the region experienced devastating floods. That much is certain. Perhaps the cultural memory of these floods merged into one great flood narrative. Perhaps multiple disasters were remembered as a single cataclysm. Or perhaps there really was one particular flood, more devastating than the others. That became the template for the story. What's clear is that the Sumerians saw a dividing line, an age before, when gods ruled directly or through impossibly long-lived kings, and an age after, when humanity was on its own, when reign lengths were human, when history started to look like what we recognize as history. The king list is trying to bridge that gap, to maintain continuity across the catastrophe, to show that kingship survived the flood. That authority was legitimate because it descended from heaven in the first place and was reestablished afterward. But it leaves us with questions. Questions we can't answer. What were they really recording? What did those numbers mean to them? How did they understand their own deep past? The stars above ancient Sumer watched all of this. Watched the cities rise. Watched the floods come. Watched scribes carefully copying the king list, generation after generation, preserving these impossible numbers. And those same stars shine tonight, unchanged, silent witnesses to everything that's come and gone. The king list is just one document, one voice, but it sets the stage for what comes next. Because if the Sumerians believed their kings once ruled for thousands of years, if they believed in an age before the flood, when things were different, then what else did they believe? What else did they record about the Anunnaki, about the gods who gave humanity kingship, who created humanity in the first place, and who, according to other texts, went to war with each other. The Sumerians understood their world as crowded with gods. Not one, not a few, but hundreds, each with a name, a role, a domain. And at the top of this cosmic hierarchy, ruling over all, were the Anunnaki. The word appears constantly in the texts, Anunnaki. In Sumerian, it can be broken down into parts. Anu refers to the sky god, the father of the gods, and Kai means earth. So the Anunnaki are, roughly translated, those who from heaven to earth came, or the offspring of heaven and earth. The exact translation is debated, but the meaning is clear enough. These are gods connected to both realms, sky and earth, heaven and the physical world. The texts tell us there are 50 great Anunnaki gods, 50 major deities who form the divine council, and below them, 300 lesser gods called the Igigi. The Igigi do the work, dig the canals, build the temples, maintain the cosmic order through labor. At least, that's how it is at first. But we'll come to that story later. At the very top, 3 gods stand above the rest, Enlil, and Enki, the great triad. Between them, they govern all creation. An is the sky itself, the Father God, the original authority. He dwells in heaven, distant, rarely intervening directly. He's the source of divine kingship, the ultimate authority to which all other gods defer. But by the time most Sumerian texts are written, En has become somewhat remote. He reigns, but he doesn't rule, not actively. That job falls to Enlil, Lord Wind or Lord Storm. Enlil is the executive power, the god who acts, who commands, who enforces cosmic law. His temple is in Nippur, the religious center of Sumer. Every other city might have its patron deity, but Nippur belongs to Enlil, and that makes it special, sacred, neutral ground where the divine council meets. Imagine the great temple at Nippur, the Akur, the mountain house. It rises above the flat Mesopotamian plain like an artificial mountain, ziggurat platforms stacked one upon another. At the summit, the Holy of Holies, Enlil's dwelling place, and from here, from this elevated throne, he issues decrees that govern both heaven and earth. Enlil is not particularly gentle. The texts describe him as stern, quick to anger, impatient with humanity. When humans become too numerous, too noisy, it's Enlil who decides to send the flood. When cities rebel, it's Enlil who authorizes their destruction. He maintains order, but order through power, through force when necessary. And then there's Enki, the third of the great gods, and in many ways, the most interesting. Enki is the god of water, fresh water. Specifically, the underground aquifer that feeds the rivers and springs. But he's more than that. He's the god of wisdom, of magic, of crafts and skills, of secrets and hidden knowledge. Where Enlil is straightforward and forceful, Enki is subtle, clever. He solves problems through ingenuity rather than power. His city is Eridu, the oldest settlement in Sumer, the place with 17 layers of temples built one upon another, and his temple is called the Abzu, the house of the underground waters, the place where sweet water rises from beneath the earth. The texts tell us that Enki dwells in the Abzu, literally underwater, in the depths, and from there he governs all wisdom and magic. He holds the Mi, pronounced May, the fundamental powers that govern reality, laws of nature, social customs, technologies, arts. All of these are Mi, cosmic principles that can be possessed, transferred, even stolen. There's a famous text where Inanna, the goddess of love and war, visits Enki in the Abzu. She gets him drunk. And while he's intoxicated, she tricks him into giving her the ME, all of them. She loads them into her boat and escapes back to her city of Uruk before Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done. He tries to get them back, sends his servants to intercept her, but she's too fast. She reaches Uruk and claims the ME as her own. This story is told with a sense of humor. Gods getting drunk, making mistakes, trying to undo their errors. It's remarkably human, remarkably relatable. These aren't distant, incomprehensible deities. They have personalities, flaws, vulnerabilities. Below the great three, there are other major gods. Inanna, who we just mentioned. She's perhaps the most complex deity in the Sumerian pantheon. Goddess of love, but also war, beauty, and violence. She's associated with Venus, the morning and evening star, the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon. And her movements across the sky were watched carefully, tracked, recorded. There's Nanna, the moon god, Utu, the sun, Ninhursag, the mother goddess, Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, each with their own temples, their own cities, their own devotees, and the texts describe relationships between them, marriages, children, affairs, conflicts. Nanna is Enlil's son, Inanna is Nanna's daughter, Utu is Inanna's brother. These aren't abstract cosmic forces. They're a family, dysfunctional, complicated, but a family nonetheless. Perhaps strangest of all, the texts describe these gods as physical beings. They eat, they drink beer, they get tired, they need rest, they wear clothes, they travel from city to city. The major gods have temples where they're believed to literally reside. And every day, priests prepare meals for them, set out food and drink, close the doors so the deity can eat in privacy, then remove the offerings afterward. Of course, the gods don't actually consume the physical food. The priests eat it or distribute it, but the ritual is performed as though the god is really there, really hungry, really needs sustenance. And according to the myths, this is exactly why humans were created, to provide this service, to feed the gods, to maintain their temples, to perform the labor that keeps the cosmic order functioning. The Anunnaki, as a group, form the divine assembly. They meet to make decisions, to pass judgment, to authorize actions. The texts describe these assemblies in detail. The gods gathering, debating, voting. It's almost democratic, except that some gods have more authority than others. Enlil chairs the assembly. An's voice carries weight. But even lesser gods can speak, can argue, can influence decisions. This is how the Sumerians understood governance, both divine and human. Kings didn't rule by personal whim. They consulted advisors, held assemblies, made collective decisions, and that earthly pattern was thought to mirror the heavenly one. Or, perhaps, the earthly pattern was modeled on the heavenly one. Perhaps the Sumerians organized their society to imitate what they believed happened among the gods. As above, so below. The stars wheel overhead, as they always have. Venus appears in the west after sunset, brilliant and steady. The moon waxes through its phases. The sun marks the days, and the Sumerians watch all of this, see the movements, and connect them to the gods they worship. The sky is not empty. It's populated. Every light has meaning. Every movement matters. The cosmos is alive with divine presence. And somewhere among all of this, in the temples and the texts and the observations of the night sky, the Sumerians preserve a story about why humanity exists, about how we came to be, about what happened when the Anunnaki decided they needed workers and what they did to get them. Let me tell you a story, not a story I'm inventing, but a story the Sumerians wrote down. It survives on tablets dating to around 1600 BCE. But the story itself is much older. It's called the Atrahasis Epic, and it begins with a problem. The Anunnaki are digging. Picture this. The world is young. The gods have divided up responsibilities. The great gods, the 50 Anunnaki, have claimed their domains, heaven, earth, sea. But the world needs work. The rivers need to be channeled. Canals must be dug to bring water to the fields. Dikes must be built to control flooding. This is backbreaking labor, endless labor, and someone has to do it. So the great Anunnaki assign the work to the lesser gods. The Igigi, 300 of them, and the Igigi begin to dig, year after year, generation after generation of gods, laboring in the mud and heat, digging trenches, hauling earth, shaping the landscape of Mesopotamia into something habitable. The text describes it clearly. The gods were digging the watercourses. They were counting the years of toil. 40 years pass, then another 40. The Igigi are exhausted, resentful. They gather at night and whisper among themselves. How much longer? When does this end? They watch the great Anunnaki, Enlil and Enki, and the others, resting in their temples while the Igigi break their backs in the mud. And finally, they've had enough. One night, after 40 years of labor, the Igigi make a decision. They stop working, they throw down their tools, and they march on Enlil's temple at Nippur. They surround it. They set fire to their digging tools. They chant and shout. They're on strike, rebelling, refusing to continue. Inside the temple, Enlil wakes to the sound of the mob outside. He's frightened, angry. He sends his servant to find out what's happening. And when he learns the Igigi are refusing to work, he calls an emergency meeting of the Divine Council. The great Anunnaki assemble and comes down from heaven. Enki arrives from the Abzu. All the major gods gather, and Enlil presents the problem. The Igigi refuse to work. They say the labor is too hard, too endless. They demand relief. What should be done? Some gods suggest punishment, crush the rebellion, force them back to work. But Enki, clever Enki, proposes a different solution. Let us create a substitute, he says. Let us create humanity. He suggests taking clay, mixing it with the flesh and blood of a slain god, and shaping it into a new creature. A creature designed specifically to do the work the Igigi refuse to do. A worker, a laborer, a servant species. The assembly agrees. The plan is approved, and Enki sets to work. The texts describe the process in detail. A minor god, one of the rebels, is selected for sacrifice. His name is Wee-Ilu, the god who has wisdom. He's killed. His blood is mixed with clay, and from this mixture, humanity is formed. Imagine Enki working, his hands in the wet clay, shaping it, molding it, the blood of a god mixing with the earth, creating something new, something that's part divine, carrying a god's essence in its blood, but also earthly, mortal, limited. 14 pieces of clay are formed, 7 male, 7 female, and the mother goddess, Ninhursag, places them in her womb. She births them, and they live, they breathe, they grow. Humanity has been created. The text doesn't treat this as a blessing. It's not a gift. Humans aren't created out of love or generosity. We're created for a purpose, a function. The text is explicit. Let man assume the drudgery of the god. That's the phrase. Humanity exists to do the work the gods don't want to do. And it works. The newly created humans begin to dig the canals, plant the fields, build the temples. The Igigi are released from labor. They can rest. The great Anunnaki are served. The world functions smoothly, for a while, but humans reproduce, quickly. Within a few generations, there are lots of humans, lots and lots of humans, spreading across the land, building villages, making noise. And this noise, this clamor of human activity, begins to bother the gods. Specifically, it bothers Enlil. The text says he cannot sleep because of the noise humans make. The disturbance grows intolerable, and Enlil decides something must be done. First, he sends a plague. Disease sweeps through the human population. Numbers drop. But Enki, who has always been protective of his creation, teaches humanity how to appeal to the gods for relief. The plague ends, humans recover, population rebounds. Enlil tries again, this time drought. He withholds the rain, crops fail, famine spreads. But again, Enki intervenes. He shows humanity how to dig wells, how to access the underground water, how to irrigate. They survive. Enlil grows more frustrated, more determined. The noise continues. Humans persist. And finally, Enlil proposes a final solution, a flood, a great deluge. Wipe them out, all of them, start over, or just leave the world empty. The divine council meets, they debate, and they agree. The flood will come, but Enki dissents. He doesn't speak openly against the decision. That would be too dangerous. But he acts quietly, secretly. He chooses one man, Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, and he warns him. The warning comes in a dream, or through the wall of a reed house. The text is ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so. Enki speaks to the wall, and Atrahasis overhears. Build a boat, Enki says. Make it waterproof. Load it with animals, with seeds, with your family. A flood is coming. Atrahasis obeys. He builds the boat. The text gives specifications, dimensions, materials. It's a large vessel, roofed, sealed with bitumen. He loads it as instructed, and he waits. The flood comes. For 7 days and 7 nights, rain falls. The rivers overflow. The dikes break. The land disappears under water. Everything drowns. Every human except Atrahasis and those on the boat. When the waters finally recede, Atrahasis releases a dove. It finds no place to land and returns. He releases a swallow. Same result. Then a raven. The raven doesn't return. Land is exposed. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis exits the boat, builds an altar, offers sacrifice. And the gods, who have been hiding in heaven, terrified by the destruction they unleashed, smell the offering, and they realize they're hungry, because there are no humans to feed them, no one to perform the rituals, no one to maintain the temples. The gods, the text says, gather like flies around the sacrifice. They're desperate, starving, and they realize they made a mistake. Enlil arrives and is furious. How did humans survive? But Enki confronts him, argues, points out that eliminating humanity was foolish. They need humans. Rely on them. The solution isn't annihilation. It's management. The assembly agrees. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but measures will be taken. Women will have difficulty in childbirth, limiting population growth. Some women will be barren. Child mortality will be high. These are harsh measures, but they allow both populations to coexist, and the story ends with a kind of truce. Gods and humans, locked in an uneasy relationship. Humans serving, gods protecting, but also limiting. Neither side fully satisfied, but both surviving. This is the story the Sumerians told about themselves, about their origin, their purpose, their place in the cosmos. They believed this, wrote it down, taught it to their children. It was their foundational narrative, and it frames everything else. Every ritual, every prayer, every temple offering. It's all rooted in this understanding. We exist to serve. We were made for labor, and the gods, powerful as they are, need us. The stars shine down on ancient Sumer, on the ziggurats and temples, on the people working in the fields, and perhaps, when they look up at those stars, they feel a strange mixture of fear and purpose. They're servants, yes, but servants of heaven, created by gods, carrying divine blood in their veins. There's dignity in that, even if the story is humbling. But this understanding, this cosmology, this careful balance between gods and humans, it shapes how the Sumerians organize their entire civilization. The Sumerians didn't believe the gods ruled by whim. There was order, structure, law, and that law was administered through something they called the divine assembly, a council of the gods, where decisions were made collectively. Imagine the Great Hall at Nippur, the Ekur, Enlil's mountain house, not the physical temple we can excavate, but the heavenly version, the divine original that the earthly temple reflects. This is where the Anunnaki gather when matters of cosmic importance must be decided. The 50 great gods take their places, and the Sky Father presides but doesn't often speak. Enlil sits at his right hand, the active authority. Enki is there, the voice of wisdom and dissent. The other major deities arranged according to rank and domain. Inanna representing love and war, Nana the moon, Utu the sun, Ninhursag the mother, all present. The assembly operates through discussion and vote. A matter is raised, debated, arguments are presented, and then a decision is reached. This isn't monarchy, it's oligarchy, rule by council. And once the assembly decides, the decision becomes cosmic law, unbreakable, fixed. This is where the ME come from. Those fundamental powers we mentioned before, the divine principles that govern reality. When the assembly grants a ME to a city, or a god, or a king, they're transferring a piece of cosmic authority, a right to rule, or to practice a craft, or to perform a ritual. The ME are like cosmic software, programming reality itself. The texts list them, hundreds of them. Kingship is a ME. Priesthood is a ME. But so is descending into the underworld. So is the art of lovemaking. So is the craft of blacksmithing. Every fundamental aspect of existence, every role, every skill, every social institution, it's all governed by ME. And the ME belong to the gods, distributed by their assembly, loaned to humanity. Cities compete for ME. Kings claim to have received them from the gods directly. And when a city is conquered, when its temple is destroyed, the victor claims to have seized its ME. Political conquest mirrors cosmic authority. Taking a city's ME means taking its very essence, its reason for existing. This system creates a web of divine governance that mirrors earthly politics. Or, again, perhaps earthly politics mirrors the divine system. The Sumerians saw no separation. Heaven and earth operated by the same principles, the same structures, the same laws. Earthly kings, when they make decisions, consult assemblies of elders, citizens, priests. This isn't just practical, it's cosmologically correct, because that's how the gods themselves govern. A king who ruled as a tyrant, ignoring counsel, would be acting contrary to divine order, inviting cosmic disapproval. The text describes specific assemblies called to decide specific matters. Should humanity be destroyed by flood? The assembly votes. Should a particular city be punished? The assembly decides. Should a king receive divine favor? The assembly must grant it. And here's something interesting. The assembly can make mistakes, can be swayed by emotion, can act hastily and then regret it. The flood narrative shows this clearly. Enlil is angry, pushes for destruction, and the assembly agrees. But afterward, when they realize they need humans, they regret the decision. Even divine wisdom has limits. Enki often plays the role of dissenter, the voice of caution or alternative approaches. When Enlil wants to destroy humanity through plague or famine or flood, Enki argues against it. He doesn't usually vote against the majority. That would be too openly rebellious. But he acts afterward, provides workarounds, protects humanity. Despite the assembly's decision, this creates a complex picture. The gods aren't unified. They have different priorities, different methods, different levels of compassion for humanity. And these differences drive much of the mythology. The tensions between Enlil and Enki, between order and wisdom, between power and cleverness. These tensions shape the stories. But there's another element to divine governance, the connection to the stars, to astronomy, to the movements of celestial bodies. The Sumerians tracked the sky meticulously. They knew the planets, which they called wandering stars, because they moved against the fixed background of stars. They associated these planets with specific gods. Jupiter was Marduk, Venus was Inanna, Saturn was Ninurta, Mars was Nergal, Mercury was Nabu, and the movements of these planets, their positions relative to each other and to the constellations, these were read as divine communication, as signs of the assembly's decisions, as omens indicating what the gods were planning or approving. Imagine a priest standing on the ziggurat at night. The air is cool, the stars brilliantly clear in the unpolluted darkness. He watches Jupiter slowly moving through the constellation we call Taurus, takes note of its position, compares it to records from previous years. The planet's movement is regular, predictable, but it carries meaning. If Jupiter is in a certain position when a king makes a decision, that's favorable. If Venus rises at dawn just before a military campaign, that's a sign from Inanna, goddess of war. The stars don't just hang there. They speak. They reveal the will of the assembly. This is why Sumerian astronomy is so advanced. They're not just curious about the sky. They need to understand it. Their political decisions, their agricultural planning, their religious calendar, everything depends on reading the movements of the gods through the movements of the planets. They develop mathematical models to predict planetary positions, star catalogs, detailed observations going back centuries. This knowledge is passed down through priestly families, guarded, sacred, because understanding the sky means understanding divine will. The Emi themselves might be connected to this. Some scholars suggest the word Me could be related to measuring, to mathematics, to the orderly patterns visible in the heavens. The cosmic laws that govern planetary motion are the same laws that govern human society. Same principles, same divine source. Everything is connected, earth and sky, temple and star, king and god. The Sumerian worldview doesn't separate these spheres. They're all part of one integrated system, one cosmic order maintained by the assembly of the Anunnaki. And this system works. For a long time, it works. The cities flourish, the crops grow, the temples stand. The priests track the stars. The people live their lives under divine governance, mediated through earthly kings who claim to represent the assembly's will. But systems, even cosmic ones, can break down, can fail, can face challenges they weren't designed to handle. And when gods disagree strongly enough, when the assembly fractures, when competing wills collide, well, that's when things start to fall apart. But we're not there yet. For now, in the golden age of Sumer, the system holds, the balance maintains, and life under the watch of the Anunnaki continues, generation after generation, beneath the steady gaze of stars that never stop their patient wheeling. Walk with me through the streets of Ur, not the ruined tell we can visit today, but the living city. The year is 2500 BCE, 4,500 years ago. The third dynasty of Ur is approaching, though the greatest monuments haven't been built yet. But still, the city thrives. 50,000 people, maybe more, living behind massive mud brick walls. The streets are narrow, buildings pressed, close together, flat-roofed houses stacked like boxes, climbing over each other for space. The wealthy have courtyards, open to the sky, where families gather in the evenings when the heat breaks. The poor live in single rooms, entire families sleeping together in spaces barely large enough to turn around in. But everyone, rich and poor, shares one thing. They live in the shadow of the ziggurat. The great temple platform dominates the city, rises from the center like a geometric mountain. 3 massive terraces stacked one upon another, mud brick faced with fired brick for strength. The bottom terrace is painted black. The second is red. The third is white. And at the summit, 70 feet above the city streets, stands the temple of Nana, the moon god. This is his city, his domain. Everything here belongs to him. Every brick, every doorway, every grain of wheat stored in the temple granaries. The king rules, yes, but he rules as Nana's representative, as the god's earthly manager. Imagine standing in the city plaza at dawn. The sky is lightening in the east, the first hints of pink touching the horizon, and you look up at the ziggurat, at the white temple catching the first rays of sun, and you understand something fundamental. This isn't a monument to human achievement. It's a house, a dwelling place, built for a god who is believed to literally inhabit it. Every morning, priests climb the long stairway to the summit. They enter the temple, draw back the curtains from around the god's bed, symbolic, since Nana himself is represented by a statue. They wash the statue, dress it in fresh robes, bring food and beer, set it before the god, close the doors to give him privacy to eat, then return, clear away the offerings, and go about the day's rituals. This happens every single day, rain or shine, war or peace. The god must be fed, must be cared for, because if the rituals stop, if Nana is neglected, he might abandon the city, withdraw his protection. And without a god's favor, a city is defenseless, doomed. The temple complex employs thousands, priests and priestesses, scribes who record offerings and maintain accounts, craftsmen who produce ritual objects, farmers who work the temple's extensive lands, herders who tend the temple flocks, fishermen who bring catch from the rivers, bakers, brewers, weavers, musicians, an entire economy organized around serving the god. And this is replicated across Sumer. Every city has its patron deity. Every deity has a temple. Every temple has its staff and lands and rituals. The gods don't just rule symbolically. They own property, generate wealth, function as economic entities. The priests manage these holdings, but always in the god's name, always as his servants. Walk beyond the temple district, into the residential areas, the merchant quarters. Here, life is more recognizably human. Children playing in the streets, women carrying water jars from the communal wells, men heading to workshops or fields. The smell of bread baking, beer fermenting, animals, goats and pigs and chickens, wandering freely. Craftsmen work in open-fronted shops. You can watch a potter at his wheel, hands moving with practiced ease, shaping clay into jars and bowls, a metalsmith hammering bronze, a weaver at her loom. These crafts are gifts from the gods. Each has its own ME, its own divine authorization. A skilled craftsman isn't just talented. He's been granted cosmic permission to practice his art. In the marketplace, trade goods from distant lands, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, a brilliant blue stone more valuable than gold, timber from Lebanon, cedar and pine, because Mesopotamia has almost no trees, copper from Oman, obsidian from Anatolia. Sumer is the center of a vast trading network, and all of it flows through the temple, which takes its cut, which redistributes wealth according to divine will. The city is literate. This is the remarkable thing. Not everyone can read and write. Literacy is limited to scribes and elites. But writing is everywhere. Cuneiform tablets documenting transactions, contracts, letters, legal disputes, and in the temple libraries, literature, hymns to Nana, prayers, myths, the stories of the Anunnaki carefully copied and preserved. Young boys, sons of scribes and officials, attend scribal schools. They spend years learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs, copying standard texts, practicing their handwriting until it's neat and uniform. It's hard work. The curriculum includes math, accounting, astronomy, law, and always, the myths, the stories of the gods. Because understanding the divine order is fundamental to functioning in this society. At night, the city quiets. Families gather in their courtyards, share meals of bread and beer and vegetables, fish if they're lucky, meet on festival days. They talk about the day's work, the city's politics, the approaching harvest. And they glance up at the sky, the moon. Nana himself waxes through his monthly cycle. The people watch him carefully. The new moon is a time of anxiety, when the god is absent or hidden. The full moon is celebration, when he shines in all his glory. Festivals are timed to the lunar calendar. Everything follows the rhythm of Nana's phases. Other cities have other gods, other rhythms. Uruk belongs to Inanna, and Venus, her star, governs their calendar. Nippur serves Enlil, and there the most important dates are tied to agricultural seasons, to planting and harvest. Eridu honors Enki, and there the focus is on water, on the spring floods that bring fertility. But all of them, every city, shares the same basic understanding. The gods are real, they're present, they have needs and desires, and human life, all of it, exists to serve those needs. This is the golden age, the peak. When Sumerian civilization functions smoothly, according to divine design, when the ziggurats rise, when the fields produce, when trade flourishes, when literature is created and preserved, when mathematics and astronomy reach sophisticated levels, when law codes are written and justice is administered, it will last for centuries. Generations of people born, living their lives, dying, all within this same system, this same worldview. The Anunnaki watching over everything. the divine assembly maintaining cosmic order, and humanity, created from clay and divine blood, doing what they were made to do. But nothing lasts forever, not even systems designed by gods. The climate is changing, subtly at first, the weather patterns shifting, droughts becoming more frequent, the rivers, never fully predictable, becoming even more irregular, sometimes flooding catastrophically, sometimes barely flowing at all, and there are human pressures too. The irrigation canals, so essential to agriculture, accumulate salt over time. The fields become less productive, need more and more water to produce the same yields. But water is limited. Disputes over water rights become more common, more bitter. Cities compete with each other, not just economically, but militarily. Border skirmishes, raids, eventually full wars, each city claiming their god supports them, each temple praying for victory. And when cities fight, when Ur battles Lagash or Uruk fights Kish, how do you resolve it? Both sides claim divine authorization. Both believe they're acting as their god's champion. The divine assembly, which is supposed to maintain order, seems unable or unwilling to intervene. Or perhaps the gods themselves are divided. Perhaps they too are in conflict. Perhaps what happens on earth mirrors discord in heaven. And there are texts, fragmentary, difficult to interpret, that suggest exactly that describe the Anunnaki fighting, that describe divine weapons, destruction, devastation that reads like something beyond normal warfare. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the war, we need to understand something else, something hidden, something the Sumerians encoded into their temples and their texts, something about the sky, about alignments and astronomy, about knowledge that seems strangely advanced. There are layers here we haven't yet explored, dimensions to this civilization that go deeper than daily life and ritual. And if we want to understand what the texts say about the final conflict, we need to first understand what the Sumerians knew, what they were tracking, what they were building. So let's look beneath the surface. Let's explore what was hidden in plain sight. Beneath the surface of the creation narratives, beneath the hymns and prayers and accounting records, there are other texts, darker texts, ones that speak of discord, of weapons, of destruction unleashed not by natural forces, but by divine will. The Sumerians didn't hide from this aspect of their gods. They recorded it, preserved it, perhaps because they believed it was important, perhaps because it was simply true, as they understood truth. One of the earliest texts to survive, the Eridu Genesis, contains fragments of a story that modern scholars piece together from multiple damaged tablets. It describes tensions among the Anunnaki, disagreements about how to govern the world, specifically conflicts between Enlil and Enki. These two gods, brothers, sons of An, represent fundamentally different approaches to cosmic order. Enlil values authority, structure, rules that are enforced. When humans become problematic, his solution is elimination. Clean slate, start over. He sees existence in terms of order and chaos must be controlled, ruthlessly if necessary. Enki represents something else: wisdom, subtlety, problem solving through cleverness rather than force. When humans multiply too rapidly, when they make too much noise, Enki's instinct isn't destruction, it's management, adaptation, finding a way for both gods and humans to coexist. This philosophical divide runs through many Sumerian texts, and it mirrors something we see in the archaeological record. Periods of centralized control alternating with periods of distributed power. Cities rising and falling. Different approaches to governance competing. And always, the question of how to balance divine authority with human agency. But there are texts that describe something beyond philosophical disagreement, that describe actual conflict, violence, war. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous Sumerian narrative, contains scenes of divine confrontation. When Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu kill the bull of heaven, Ishtar's monster, the gods are outraged. They meet in assembly, they demand punishment, and they decree that one of the two heroes must die. This is presented as divine retribution, but also as internal divine politics. Some gods favor Gilgamesh, others oppose him. The assembly is divided. Later, when Gilgamesh seeks immortality, travels to meet Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, he learns that immortality was granted only once, as a special exception. The gods decided humans should remain mortal, and that decision stands. Even for kings, even for heroes. The divine assembly has ruled, and their ruling is final. But Utnapishtim's story itself reveals divine conflict. The flood was sent by Enlil, approved by the assembly, but opposed by Enki. One god acting against the collective decision, protecting humanity despite the assembly's vote. This is sedition, rebellion. And yet Enki isn't punished for it. Perhaps because the outcome proves him right. Perhaps because even among gods, wisdom sometimes trumps authority. There are other texts that describe more explicit conflict. The Lament for Ur, written after that great city was destroyed around 2000 BCE, describes devastation that the author attributes directly to divine decision. Enlil has abandoned his temple, the text says. The gods have turned away, and without divine protection, invaders sweep in. The city burns. The population is slaughtered or enslaved. But the text goes further. It describes destruction that seems to come from the sky. From above they came, like a raging storm. The language is ambiguous, could refer to human armies, but could also suggest something else, something falling from heaven. Divine weapons deployed against a city that had fallen out of favor. And then there's the Era Epic. This is perhaps the most troubling text, most unsettling in its descriptions. Era is a war god, a deity of plague and violence, and the epic describes what happens when he decides to go on a rampage. When he convinces Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, to temporarily leave his temple, to step away from cosmic governance. And in Marduk's absence, Era unleashes devastation. The descriptions are specific. Cities destroyed, populations wiped out. But the language used, the imagery employed, it doesn't sound like normal warfare. It sounds like something else. Like the flames of a fire god, devastating. Weapons nobody can escape. Radiation might be too modern a translation, but the Akkadian word used suggests something spreading, contaminating, poisoning. Water becomes undrinkable. Fields become barren. People sicken and die even if they weren't directly attacked. Perhaps this is just poetic exaggeration, the way ancient texts often amplify to make a point. Perhaps the author is describing a particularly brutal military campaign using vivid metaphor. But the precision is striking, the detail, the way the text carefully distinguishes between those killed in initial attacks and those who die afterward from something else, something lingering. Ninurta, another war god, is described in various texts as possessing weapons that can pull out mountains by their roots, that can make the earth tremble, that flash with light and thunder. Some of this clearly describes storms, lightning, natural phenomena attributed to divine action, but some of it doesn't quite fit that interpretation. Modern scholars debate these texts constantly. Most interpret them as mythology, as humans projecting their fears and their experience of warfare onto cosmic scale, as poetic dramatization of political collapse and military defeat. And that's probably correct. Probably. But there's something else worth considering. Something hidden in these narratives. The Sumerians and their successors were careful observers. They recorded what they saw with remarkable accuracy. Their astronomical observations are precise. Their descriptions of medical symptoms are clinically detailed. Their engineering specifications are technically sound. So when they describe divine weapons with this level of detail, when they use specific vocabulary for different types of destruction, when they distinguish between immediate effects and delayed effects, are they just inventing? Or are they describing something they've seen, something they're trying to make sense of within their theological framework? We don't know, can't know. The texts remain, but their true meaning is hidden beneath layers of language, culture, and time. What we can say is this: the Sumerians believed their gods fought, not just argued, but actually fought, with weapons, with consequences. And those conflicts, whether remembered, imagined, or metaphorical, shaped how they understood their own history, their own catastrophes, the collapses they witnessed and survived. Perhaps every time a city fell, every time drought or flood or invasion devastated the land, people asked themselves why, and the answer, the only answer that made sense within their worldview, was divine conflict. The gods are fighting. We're caught in the middle. Our suffering reflects their discord. The stars wheel overhead, silent and steady. But beneath that apparent order, beneath the predictable motions of planets and the regular phases of the moon, the Sumerians saw something else: a cosmic struggle, powers competing, authority challenged, order maintained, but only through constant vigilance, constant negotiation, sometimes constant warfare. And if we want to understand what they meant by the final war, the conflict that some texts suggest ended the age of direct divine rule, we need to look more closely at what they say happened, at the flood that marked a boundary, at the weapons described, at the aftermath they recorded. But first, we need to understand what the flood story actually contains, what details are preserved, what they suggest. You know the story, of course you do. A flood, a boat, animals saved, humanity given a second chance. It's one of the most widespread narratives in human culture. Flood myths appear in dozens of civilizations across the world. But the Sumerian version, the original written account, contains details that often get lost in later retellings. Let's look beneath the familiar surface, at what's actually recorded in the tablets. The flood, in Sumerian cosmology, isn't random, isn't punishment for sin in the way later traditions frame it. It's a population control measure. Enlil cannot sleep because of human noise. That's the stated reason. Humans have multiplied beyond what the gods intended, and the solution, approved by the divine assembly, is elimination. But here's what's hidden in that simple framework. The decision takes time, multiple attempts. First disease, then famine, then drought. Each time, Enki subverts the plan, teaches humanity how to survive, and each time, the population recovers. This pattern suggests something, not divine whim, but a genuine problem the gods are trying to solve. how to limit human population without eliminating the species entirely. The flood is presented as a final solution, total, comprehensive. The great gods agreed to send the flood, the Atrahasis text says clearly. This is unanimous. Even Enki, though he'll act secretly against it, doesn't vote against the assembly in open session. The decision is cosmic law. But what interests modern scholars, what makes them pause and wonder, is the detail in the account of how Atrahasis is warned, and particularly the specifications for the boat. The text is remarkably technical. The boat is to be roofed over, sealed completely, coated with bitumen inside and out, loaded not just with family and animals, but with the seed of all living things, food for a long journey, water supplies. The dimensions are given in cubits, measurements that translate to a vessel roughly 300 feet long, proportioned in a way that modern naval architects recognize as unusually stable. This isn't vague, it's a blueprint, preserved across multiple copies of the text with remarkable consistency. Why such detail? If this is just mythology, just a story to explain ancient floods, why include engineering specifications? Perhaps because the author, whoever first composed this narrative, wanted it to be believable, wanted listeners to imagine it could actually work, or perhaps, just perhaps, because the specifications were remembered, passed down, preserved because they were considered important. The flood itself is described with equal precision. 7 days and 7 nights, rain from above, but also the fountains of the deep opening, water from below, a combination of precipitation and groundwater flooding, the kind of catastrophic flood that would require both, that would submerge everything, leave nowhere to escape. Geologically, we know Mesopotamia flooded regularly. The rivers are unpredictable. The land is flat. When they overflow, vast areas disappear underwater. Archaeologists have found flood layers at multiple Sumerian sites, evidence of catastrophic inundations. But these don't all date to the same period. They're different events, different disasters. So, perhaps the Sumerian flood narrative is a composite. Many floods, many disasters, compressed into one great flood that serves as a mythological marker, a way to divide time into before and after, pre-flood and post-flood, the age when gods ruled directly, and the age when they withdrew. But there's something else hidden in the narrative, something about divine regret. When the flood comes, when the waters rise and humanity drowns, the gods hide in heaven. The text is clear about this. They're terrified by what they've unleashed. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They withdrew to the heaven of Anu. They huddle together like dogs in the uppermost heaven, cowering. This image is striking, uncomfortable even. These are supposed to be all-powerful beings, yet they're frightened, hiding, unable or unwilling to stop what they've started. And when Atrahasis finally emerges from the boat, builds his altar, offers sacrifice, the gods smell the offering and gather like flies around it. They're desperate, starving. They need the offering, need human service, need humanity. Enlil arrives last, sees survivors, explodes in rage. Who let humans live? But Enki confronts him. And here, buried in this confrontation, is something profound. Enki essentially argues that Enlil acted rashly, that the assembly made a mistake, that wisdom should have tempered power. The assembly, usually so sure, usually so authoritative, admits error, implicitly, by agreeing to let humanity continue. by implementing the compromise Enki proposes: shorter lifespans, difficult childbirth, high infant mortality. These are cruel measures, yes, but they allow coexistence. What does this tell us? What's hidden beneath this narrative of cosmic policy making? Perhaps it's an acknowledgement that authority without wisdom leads to catastrophe. That power must be balanced by compassion. Or perhaps it's simpler. Perhaps it's a story about the danger of acting from anger, from frustration, from intolerance of noise and disorder. The gods nearly destroyed their own creation out of irritation, and then regretted it, nearly starved themselves, nearly eliminated the very beings they depended on. This is remarkably human, remarkably relatable, acting in anger, regretting afterward, unable to undo what's been done. But there's another layer, another possibility hidden in these texts. What if the flood narrative preserves memory of actual climate catastrophe? Not just regional flooding, but global events at the end of the Ice Age? Between 15,000 and 7,000 BCE, sea levels rose over 300 feet, coastlines moved hundreds of miles inland, entire landscapes drowned, river valleys flooded. This happened. We have geological proof, and it happened within the time frame of human memory, of oral tradition. Could stories of these drowning coastlines have been preserved, passed down through generations, eventually written down as the flood narrative, but retaining some core of historical truth? The details changed, overlaid with theology and myth. But the memory of real catastrophe still present? We don't know. The timeline is difficult. Oral traditions can last thousands of years. Australian Aboriginal songs prove that. But can they last 10,000 years? Preserve accurate details across 400 generations? It seems unlikely, but not impossible. What's certain is that the flood narrative marks a boundary in Sumerian cosmology. Everything before is different. Kings reign for thousands of years. Gods interact directly with humans. The world operates by different rules. Everything after is more recognizable, more historical, more human-scaled. The flood is the hinge, the moment of transformation. And it's presented not as natural disaster, but as divine decision, followed by divine regret, as cosmic war against humanity, and then cosmic reconciliation. Perhaps that's the hidden message, that even gods can make mistakes, even divine assemblies can act unwisely, and survival, continuation, depends on someone, some voice, arguing for mercy, for wisdom, for the long view. Enki becomes humanity's protector in these narratives, not because he loves humans particularly, but because he's clever enough to see that eliminating them is foolish, that the system requires them, that gods and humans are locked in mutual dependence. The silence after the flood, the waters receding, Atrahasis stepping onto dry land. It's not just physical restoration, it's a new covenant, a new arrangement, gods and humans continuing, but on revised terms. The age of innocence, if it ever existed, is over. Now there's wariness, distance, rules and limits, but at least there's survival, continuation. The story doesn't end with the flood. It continues after, and that, perhaps, is what matters most. What's hidden in plain sight, the resilience, the refusal to let catastrophe be final. The stars still wheel overhead, the moon still waxes and wanes, and humanity, reduced but surviving, begins again, builds again, remembers, and writes it all down on clay tablets that will outlast the very cities that produced them. There are descriptions in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts that make modern readers pause, that create a strange cognitive dissonance, because the language used, the details provided, sound wrong for ancient mythology, sound too specific. Let's look at what's actually written, what the tablets actually say. In the Lugal-e epic, a text describing the god Ninurta's battles, there's an inventory of weapons. The 7 evil weapons are listed. Each has a name. Each has specific properties. And the descriptions, while poetic, contain technical vocabulary that suggests functional differences, not just metaphorical variety. One weapon is described as flashing like lightning. Another roars like thunder. A third spreads devastation that cannot be seen. A fourth makes the earth tremble. These sound like natural phenomena, storm imagery, earthquake metaphors, and that's probably what they are. But then there are other descriptions. Weapons that nobody can escape once they are deployed. Weapons that cause delayed effects. People sicken and die days or weeks after the weapon is used. Fields become barren. Water becomes poisonous. Animals refuse to graze. These descriptions are harder to dismiss as simple storm imagery. The Era epic, which we touched on earlier, is perhaps the most troubling text. It describes the god Era, essentially a personification of plague and violence, going on a destructive rampage, and the effects are described with unsettling precision. I will devastate cities. I will make abandon the dwellings. I will dry up the rivers. I will make the vegetation wither. I will make the land shake. I will make the mountains tremble. Standard divine destruction language. But then it continues. Whoever sees my weapon cannot escape. They will fall down. The one who was sick and recovered will fall sick again and not recover. The place I destroy will not be inhabited for 40 years. That last detail is striking, specific. Why 40 years? Why not forever? Why not until the gods relent? The number suggests a time period based on observation, on experience, on knowing how long something takes to dissipate, decay, become safe again. Perhaps we're reading too much into it. Perhaps 40 is just a standard number in Mesopotamian literature, a symbolic duration. We see it elsewhere. 40 days and nights of flood, 40 years wandering. It's possible the number means a long time rather than a literal count, but it appears in a context that's otherwise quite specific. The text distinguishes between immediate casualties and long-term effects, between those killed by the weapon directly and those who sicken afterward, between damage to structures and contamination of land. Ninurta's weapons are described as having the power to tear out mountains by their roots. The Sharur, Ninurta's primary weapon, is described as having the force of a destructive storm, but also as being able to reach any place, even in the netherworld. It strikes with precision, from a distance, unerringly. Some of this is clearly mythological amplification. Gods need impressive weapons. The more powerful the weapon, the more fearsome the god. This is standard religious literature, making divine beings appropriately awesome through their armaments. But hidden beneath the amplification, there might be something else. The Sumerians were careful observers. When they described agricultural techniques, they were accurate. When they described astronomical phenomena, they were precise. When they described medical symptoms, they were clinically detailed. So when they described weapons, why assume they were purely inventing? Perhaps they were describing the most devastating weapons they knew. Siege engines, Greek fire, though that's later. Sophisticated archery, the psychological impact of warfare. All of it projected onto divine scale. The best human weapons, imagined as wielded by gods, naturally become world-destroying. Or perhaps, and this is where we move into pure speculation, perhaps they were describing something they'd seen or heard about, some catastrophic event, some devastation, and trying to make sense of it within their theological framework. Cometary impacts, for instance. A large meteor strike would produce effects matching some of these descriptions. Flash of light, thunderous sound, shaking earth, widespread destruction, lingering fires, contaminated water from heated minerals. This has happened in human history. Tunguska in 1908, meteor crater in Arizona, though that's much older. Such events would have been terrifying, inexplicable, naturally attributed to divine action. Volcanic eruptions could also match some descriptions. The explosion of Thera, Santorini, around 1600 BCE devastated the Mediterranean. Ashfall, tsunamis, climate disruption, crops failing for years afterward. If such an event occurred during Sumerian times, or if memory of such events was preserved from earlier catastrophes, it might be recorded as divine weapons deployed in anger. The problem is we're looking backward through a distorting lens. The texts use the only vocabulary available to them: divine action, cosmic weapons, battles in heaven. But what physical events might they be describing? What natural disasters, what catastrophes might be encoded in this mythological language? We can't know for certain, but the specificity is intriguing. The careful distinctions between different types of effects, the technical vocabulary for weapons, for destruction, for aftermath. This suggests observation, experience, something real being processed through mythological interpretation. There's another possibility, one more unsettling. What if the descriptions aren't exaggerations? What if advanced technology existed and was lost? This is fringe archaeology, not accepted by mainstream scholars. But the question persists. How did ancient peoples move massive stones? How did they achieve precision that challenges modern capabilities? How did they acquire astronomical knowledge that should have required instruments they supposedly didn't have? The standard answer is patience, generations of observation, clever use of simple tools, massive labor forces. And that answer is probably correct for most achievements. But it leaves some questions unresolved, some techniques unexplained, some knowledge sources unclear. The Sumerians themselves offer a different explanation. They say the gods taught them. The Anunnaki descended, brought knowledge, brought skills, brought the me, those cosmic principles that include technological know-how. And when the gods departed or withdrew, much of that knowledge was lost. This is mythology, but it's mythology that tries to answer a real question. Where did civilization come from? How did humans go from hunter-gatherers to city builders so quickly? The archaeological record shows the transition happening remarkably fast. The Neolithic Revolution, the Urban Revolution. Within a few thousand years, from scattered villages to complex states. That's astonishingly rapid in evolutionary terms. The Sumerians answer, the gods taught us. Modern archaeology answers, social evolution and technological accumulation. Both are trying to explain the same rapid transformation. But the weapon descriptions remain troubling, specific, describing effects that, if taken literally, sound disturbingly advanced. Flash like lightning, spread unseen devastation, poison land for 40 years, make people sicken in delayed fashion. Are we meant to take them literally? Probably not, Probably they're poetic, metaphorical, symbolic of divine power rather than actual weaponry, the sensible interpretation, the scholarly consensus. And yet, the silence after, the sense of ending these texts convey, the final war that some sources hint at, the age when gods withdrew from direct involvement. Something changed, something ended, and the texts preserve memory of that change as catastrophic conflict. Perhaps it's all symbolic, the transition from one age to another, from bronze to iron, from Sumerian to Akkadian dominance, from direct theocracy to more secular kingship. Real historical transitions recorded in mythological language, or perhaps buried beneath the myth, beneath the theology. There's a memory of something more, something we've lost, something that ended badly. The stars offer no answers. They shine as they always have. Silent, patient, watching human civilizations rise and fall and rise again. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden in these troubling texts. Not the specific nature of ancient weapons, but the universal pattern of hubris and fall, of power misused, of knowledge gained and lost. The tablets remain, clay-fired hard, preserving words that still have power to disturb us, to make us wonder, to remind us that every age thinks it understands the past, and every age is only partly right. What's hidden may stay hidden, or it may emerge, slowly, as we learn to read these ancient voices more carefully, more humbly, without assuming we already know what they must mean. The mystery endures, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some things should remain veiled, protected by time and silence, and the patient endurance of baked clay, pressed with wedges thousands of years ago. The question that echoes through every translation, every excavation, every careful reading of these ancient tablets is this: what were they really describing? What did they mean when they wrote about the Anunnaki? When they detailed divine conflicts? When they preserved stories of floods and weapons and cosmic assemblies? Some scholars take the straightforward view. These are myths, pure mythology. The Sumerians, like all ancient peoples, created stories to explain their world. The gods represent natural forces. Enlil is the storm. Enki is water. Inanna is the planet Venus, but also love and war, and all the contradictory passions humans experience. The flood is memory of regional flooding, common in Mesopotamia, elevated to cosmic significance. The weapons are metaphors for natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, cometary impacts, perhaps. This interpretation treats the text as purely symbolic, religious literature serving religious purposes, teaching moral lessons, explaining social structures, justifying political authority. Kings claim descent from gods to legitimize their rule. Priests claim to interpret divine will to maintain their power. The stories aren't meant to be historical, they're meant to be meaningful, to provide framework, to answer existential questions about why humans exist and what their purpose is. And this view has merit, substantial merit. Most ancient religious texts function this way. Creation myths worldwide follow similar patterns. Divine beings shape the world, create humanity, establish order, fight chaos. These are universal human concerns, expressed through culturally specific narratives. The Sumerian version is just one variant among many, but others suggest a different possibility. Maybe these texts preserve actual historical memory, not literal accounts, but distorted memories of real events, real catastrophes, real rapid changes that people tried to understand through the lens of theology. The end of the Ice Age, between 15,000 and 7,000 BCE, brought massive environmental changes. Sea levels rose, coastlines drowned, climate zones shifted, entire ecosystems transformed. People living through this would have experienced it as cataclysmic, slow by our standards, taking thousands of years, but devastating nonetheless, forcing migration, destroying settlements, creating crisis after crisis. Perhaps oral traditions preserved memory of these changes, passed down through hundreds of generations, eventually written down in Sumerian as the flood narrative, the before time when things were different, when the Persian Gulf was dry land and river valleys were habitable, the catastrophe that divided ages, the world that drowned. This theory suggests that mythology isn't pure invention. It's distorted history, real events filtered through theological interpretation. The gods didn't send the flood, but rising seas did flood the world as ancient peoples knew it. The gods didn't create humans in an instant, but human civilization did emerge relatively rapidly in Mesopotamia. The framework is mythological, but the core might be historical. Some take this further, much further. They point to the specificity of certain details, the boat dimensions, the weapon descriptions, the astronomical knowledge, and they ask, what if the Sumerians were recording something more literal? What if there was advanced knowledge, advanced technology that existed and was lost? This is where mainstream scholarship and alternative archaeology diverge sharply. The academic consensus is clear. There's no evidence of lost advanced civilizations. The archaeological record shows steady, if sometimes rapid, human development. No gaps, no missing technology, just patient accumulation of knowledge and skills over millennia. But the alternative view persists, points to anomalies, unexplained precision in stone cutting, astronomical alignments that seem to require sophisticated observation, mathematical knowledge that appears too early in the record, and asks, what if something was lost? What if the Sumerians really were recording received knowledge taught by someone, something, the Anunnaki as ancient astronauts? This theory, popularized in the 1970s but with older roots, suggests the gods were actual beings, extraterrestrial visitors, advanced entities who came to Earth, interacted with early humans, perhaps even genetically engineered humanity for labor. The texts are read literally. Those who from heaven to earth came means exactly that. They came from the sky, from space. Their weapons were technological. Their cities were advanced outposts. Their departure was literal, leaving Earth when their mission ended or their conflict resolved. Mainstream archaeology rejects this completely, points out that every supposedly impossible ancient achievement can be explained through known techniques and human ingenuity. That reading ancient texts literally ignores how religious literature works. That assuming extraterrestrial intervention isn't necessary when human capability suffices. And yet, the questions don't fully disappear. The Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge about Sirius that seems impossibly detailed for their technological level. Australian Aboriginal stories describe coastlines that match geological surveys of landscapes drowned 10,000 years ago. Oral traditions can preserve accurate information across immense time spans. So maybe, just maybe, there's something in these old stories beyond pure invention. Some kernel of observation, some thread of memory. Not necessarily ancient astronauts or lost super civilizations, but perhaps something we haven't fully considered yet. Others point to psychological explanations. Carl Jung's collective unconscious. archetypes that appear across cultures because they emerge from shared human psyche. The flood myth appears worldwide because floods are universal human experience. The dying and rising god appears repeatedly because it reflects the agricultural cycle. The war in heaven reflects internal human conflict projected outward. This view treats mythology as revealing not external history, but internal truth, human nature, human fears, human hopes. The Anunnaki aren't real beings, but psychological realities, aspects of consciousness, ways humans understand power, authority, creativity, destruction. And maybe that's the most important truth anyway. Whether the gods were real, remembered, or imagined, they reveal how the Sumerians understood themselves, their relationship to authority, to nature, to each other, to the cosmos. The stories are true, not as history, but as self-understanding. Perhaps we're asking the wrong questions entirely. Perhaps what really happened misses the point. Perhaps the real question is, what did these stories do for the people who told them? How did they function? What needs did they serve? They provided meaning, explained existence, justified social structure, connected humans to cosmos, offered framework for ethics, created shared identity. These are profound functions. Whether the Anunnaki literally existed matters less than what believing in them accomplished. Or perhaps, and this is where I find myself resting most comfortably, perhaps we should hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, not demanding certainty, not choosing one interpretation and rejecting all others, but sitting with ambiguity, with mystery, with the honest acknowledgement that we don't and may never fully know. The tablets exist. That's certain. They say what they say. But what they mean, what they truly preserve, that remains open to interpretation, open to new evidence, open to future understanding that we can't yet imagine. And maybe that's okay. Maybe certainty isn't the goal. Maybe wonder is enough. Maybe sitting with these ancient voices, listening carefully, respecting their complexity, that's more valuable than resolving them into neat answers. The stars wheel overhead. The same stars the Sumerians watched. And they offer no answers, just presence, just continuation, just the reminder that mystery has always been part of human experience, that not knowing is ancient, that questions endure longer than answers. We may never know what the Sumerians meant by the Anunnaki, may never resolve whether their stories preserve history or create mythology, may never determine if their weapon descriptions encoded real events or poetic imagination. But we have the tablets. We have the words. We have the opportunity to wonder, and perhaps that's gift enough. There are texts that describe an ending, not humanity's end. We survived, but the ending of something else, an age, an era, a particular relationship between heaven and earth that the Sumerians believed had once existed. The era epic stands at the center of these ending narratives. We've touched on it before, but let's look more carefully now at what it actually describes, what scholars make of it, what remains mysterious. Era is a relatively minor god, associated with plague and violence and scorched earth. Not one of the great Anunnaki, but dangerous nonetheless. And the epic describes what happens when Era becomes restless, when he wants to act, when he convinces Marduk. By this point in history, the chief god of Babylon, to temporarily vacate his throne, Marduk agrees, leaves his temple, goes to have his regalia cleaned and restored, the text says, and in his absence, cosmic order weakens. Era seizes the opportunity, goes on a rampage, cities are destroyed, population scattered, the land itself becomes contaminated. Some scholars read this as political allegory. Marduk represents Babylonian supremacy. Era represents chaos, perhaps foreign invasion or internal collapse. The story encodes a specific historical period, perhaps the invasions of the 12th century BCE that disrupted the entire Near East. Real political collapse described in mythological terms. Others suggest it preserves memory of actual catastrophe, natural disaster, perhaps earthquake, perhaps volcanic eruption affecting distant regions but remembered in Mesopotamian tradition. The descriptions of poisoned water and barren land, these could match volcanic ashfall, sulfur contamination. Environmental disaster attributed to divine conflict, because how else would ancient peoples explain it? But the text includes that troubling detail we mentioned before. The 40 years. The contaminated land that cannot be inhabited for 40 years. This has prompted some, a very few, to suggest nuclear warfare, radioactive fallout, ancient atomic weapons. This is fringe theory, not accepted by academic scholarship, but the specificity of 40 years, the descriptions of lingering effects, the careful distinction between immediate and delayed casualties. It makes people wonder. Most likely, it's metaphorical. 40 is a significant number throughout Mesopotamian and biblical literature. It means a long time. Eebee, generation, an era. The text simply means the land remains ruined for a generation. Will eventually recover, but not quickly. There's no need to invoke nuclear weapons or any other advanced technology. And yet the question persists. Why this kind of detail? Why such precise descriptions if it's all invention? Perhaps because the authors were describing the most terrible things they could imagine, projecting their fears of war and collapse onto cosmic scale, creating cautionary tales about what happens when order breaks down, when gods fight, when authority fractures. The ending of the Era epic is interesting, though. Era's violence eventually exhausts itself. Marduk returns, order is restored, but something has changed. The text suggests that direct divine involvement, the gods walking among humans, intervening constantly, that age is over. The gods withdraw to a more distant oversight. Humans must manage themselves more. This parallels other texts, other narratives that describe a transition. The king list, with its impossible reign lengths before the flood and more normal ones after. The flood narratives themselves, with their theme of divine regret and withdrawal. A consistent pattern across multiple texts. An age ended, something changed. Direct theocracy gave way to something else. Historically, we can track this transition. The early Sumerian city-states were temple economies. The god literally owned the city. The temple controlled everything. But over time, secular authority grew. Kings became more independent, claimed divine mandate, but exercised autonomous power. By the time of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, kingship is distinct from priesthood. The king receives law from the gods, but administers it himself. Maybe that's all these ending narratives describe. Political evolution, the transition from theocracy to monarchy, from divine rule to divine authorization of human rule. Real historical change framed in mythological language. Or maybe there's more. Maybe something did happen, some series of catastrophes, environmental or social or military, that forced change, that ended the old order, that made the Bronze Age collapse into the Iron Age, that scattered populations and disrupted trade networks and destroyed cities. We know this happened around 1200 BCE, widespread collapse, the Sea Peoples, drought, famine, the destruction of most major Bronze Age civilizations. Only Egypt survives relatively intact. Everywhere else, chaos, cities abandoned, writing systems lost, trade networks severed, population declining. Perhaps these ending narratives, written down mostly in the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, preserve memory of this collapse. The final war isn't a single conflict, but the cumulative catastrophes of the Bronze Age collapse. The gods fighting represents civilizations fighting. The divine withdrawal represents the loss of the old order, the death of the palatial economies, the end of the bureaucratic temple states. This interpretation has merit, fits the timeline, explains the transition the texts describe. The gods withdrew, meaning the old certainties collapsed, the old structures failed, and humanity entered a darker age, remembered as the time when heaven turned away. But others point to even older catastrophes. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests cometary fragments struck Earth around 12,800 years ago, caused wildfires, triggered climate shifts, perhaps even caused the extinction of megafauna in North America. If this happened, if the effects were global, survivors would remember, would tell stories, would try to explain why the sky rained fire and the world went cold and the great beasts disappeared. Could these stories, preserved in oral tradition for 10,000 years, eventually be written down in Sumer as the War of the Gods, as divine weapons destroying the earth? It seems like a stretch. Oral tradition across 400 generations, preserving specific details? But again, Aboriginal Australian evidence suggests it's possible, difficult to believe, but not impossible. We may never know what, if anything, these ending narratives preserve, may never determine if they're purely theological or encode historical events, or remember ancient catastrophes, or simply reflect the human tendency to divide time into before and after when major changes occur. What we can say is this: the Sumerians and their successors believed an age had ended, believed the gods once interacted more directly, believed that relationship changed, fractured, withdrew, and they tried to explain why, tried to preserve memory of the transition, tried to make sense of a world where the gods seemed more distant than their ancestors claimed they'd once been. And isn't that a universal human experience? Every generation looks back and thinks things were clearer then, more certain, more direct. Every culture has stories of a golden age followed by decline, of gods who walked among humans but then departed, of direct divine presence replaced by mediated, distant, uncertain communication. Maybe that's the real truth hidden in these final war narratives. Not literal conflict, not historical catastrophe, but the universal human sense of loss, of distance from the sacred, of living in a diminished age compared to what came before. Or maybe not. Maybe something really did happen. Maybe there really was a transition, a change, an ending that launched something new. The tablets don't tell us clearly, can't tell us clearly, because they're written in theological language for theological purposes. Trying to extract literal history from them is like trying to extract literal truth from poetry. You can do it, but you lose something essential in the process. Perhaps the wisdom lies in accepting the ambiguity, in letting the texts speak as they are. Religious literature that might preserve history, might encode catastrophe, might project psychology, might do all three simultaneously. Multi-layered, complex, resistant to simple interpretation. The stars offer no clarity. They shine as they always have, watching ages rise and fall, watching humans try to make sense of their place in an often confusing cosmos, and they remain silent, patient, enduring, as do the tablets. Clay pressed with wedges 5,000 years ago, still speaking, still resisting easy answers, still inviting wonder. We may never know if there was a final war, may never determine what ended the age of the Anunnaki, may never resolve whether divine beings literally withdrew or humans simply changed how they understood divine presence. But we know they believed something ended, something changed, and they wrote it down, preserved it, passed it forward to us. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery itself is the message. That certainty is elusive, that truth is layered, that ancient voices speak, but speak in ways that require patience, humility, and comfort with not knowing. The night deepens, the questions remain, the tablets endure, and somewhere in that space between certainty and doubt, between history and mythology, between what was and what might have been, the story continues, waiting, patient, still speaking to anyone willing to listen carefully. The cities fell, one by one, over centuries. The great Sumerian city-states declined. Ur was abandoned around 2000 BCE. Uruk shrank. Nippur persisted but diminished. New powers rose, Akkadian speakers, then Babylonians, then Assyrians, each building on Sumerian foundations but creating their own empires, their own identities. But the stories didn't die. That's the remarkable thing. The myths of the Anunnaki, the creation narratives, the flood accounts, all of it was preserved, copied, translated, passed forward through time by peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped under different names, but recognized something valuable in the old Sumerian texts. The Akkadians, who conquered Sumer around 2300 BCE, didn't destroy Sumerian literature. They translated it, adopted it, made it their own. They learned to read Sumerian the way we learn to read Latin, as a classical language, no longer spoken but still essential. And they copied the old tablets, preserved them in their libraries, taught them in their schools. Gilgamesh was originally a Sumerian story, but we know it best in its Akkadian version. The Epic of Gilgamesh, found in Assyrian libraries dating to the 7th century BCE, centuries after Sumer itself disappeared. But the core story, the journey, the friendship, the search for immortality, the flood narrative within the larger epic, all of it comes from Sumerian originals, translated, adapted, but fundamentally preserved. The Babylonians did the same. When Babylon rose to dominance under Hammurabi around 1750 BCE, the scribes there collected Sumerian texts, studied them, absorbed the mythology, and adapted it. Marduk, Babylon's patron god, was elevated to chief deity, but the structure of divine governance, the assembly of gods, the cosmic order, all of it retained Sumerian framework, same system, different names. Even the names sometimes persisted. Enki became Ea, Enlil became Elil, Inanna became Ishtar. The sounds shift with language change, but the deities remain recognizable, the stories intact, the relationships preserved. And when Assyria conquered Babylon, when Nineveh became the dominant power, the pattern continued. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who ruled in the 7th century BCE, was perhaps history's first great bibliophile. He collected texts obsessively, sent scribes throughout his empire to copy every tablet they could find, brought them all to Nineveh, created a library of tens of thousands of texts. And when Austin Henry Layard excavated that library in 1849, when George Smith translated those tablets in the 1870s. When the world learned that the Epic of Gilgamesh existed, contained a flood narrative, predated the Bible, all of that Sumerian material came flooding back into human consciousness after being lost for 2,000 years. The library at Nineveh burned when the city fell in 612 BCE. The Assyrian Empire collapsed, but fire, paradoxically, preserved the tablets, baked them harder, made them more durable. They were buried under the ruins, forgotten, sleeping, but intact. And now, in museums around the world, you can see them. Actual tablets, actual wedge marks pressed 5,000 years ago. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis Epic, the Era Epic, hymns to Inanna, laments for fallen cities, king lists, creation myths, all there, all preserved, speaking again. Even now, scholars are still translating, still finding new texts, still piecing together fragments. The British Museum alone holds hundreds of thousands of tablets. Many haven't been fully studied yet. New discoveries happen regularly. A tablet that's been sitting in storage for a century suddenly reveals a missing piece of a known story, or a completely unknown text, or a new version of a familiar narrative that changes how we understand it. In Iraq, despite decades of conflict, despite the looting of the National Museum in 2003, archaeological work continues. New excavations at Ur-Rayr, at Uruk, at Lagash, modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, revealing structures beneath the sand that haven't been seen for 4,000 years. The work is painstaking, difficult, often dangerous, but it continues, and what's being discovered is continuity. Evidence that the sites never completely died, that people continued to visit them even centuries after abandonment, that memory persisted, that the ruins were recognized as sacred even when no one remembered exactly why. Medieval Arab geographers recorded tells, mysterious mounds in the desert. Locals told stories about them, called them cities of the jinn, ancient places of power. The specific history was lost, the names forgotten, but some sense of significance remained, some awareness that these places mattered. The biblical tradition preserved Mesopotamian material too. The Garden of Eden, placed at the confluence of rivers, clearly draws on Mesopotamian geography. The Tower of Babel, obviously a ziggurat. The flood narrative, nearly identical to the Sumerian original. Genesis was written around 500 BCE, 1,000 years after the tablets it echoes, but the memory carried forward, transformed, reinterpreted, but preserved. Jewish scholars during the Babylonian exile, 586-538 BCE, encountered Mesopotamian literature directly, lived in Babylon, learned cuneiform perhaps, certainly heard the stories, and when they wrote down their own traditions, their own creation accounts, they drew on this material, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes inverting the meaning, but always engaging with it. So the Sumerian material flows forward into Akkadian, into Babylonian, into Assyrian, into Hebrew, into Greek, through Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote Mesopotamian history in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, and then into Latin, into Arabic, into European languages as Greek and Roman sources were rediscovered during the Renaissance. But always, until the 19th century, indirectly, through retellings, through adaptations, through fragments quoted in later works, the actual Sumerian tablets, the original voices, remained buried, silent, waiting. Still today, new translations appear, new insights emerge. Scholars debate the meaning of specific words, the interpretation of difficult passages. What seemed clear a generation ago becomes ambiguous. What was mysterious becomes clearer. The conversation continues. The tablets keep speaking, but what they're saying keeps shifting as our understanding deepens, and the questions they raise remain alive. Contemporary debates about consciousness, about artificial intelligence, about what makes us human, echo the Atrahasis epic. Created beings, made for purpose, developing autonomy. Their creators uncertain what to do with them. Ancient question, modern resonance, debates about climate change, about human impact on environment, about sustainability, echo the Sumerian understanding of balance, of limits, of consequences when divine-human or human-environment relationships break down. Old wisdom, current relevance. The stories of divine conflict, of weapons too powerful to control, of assembly decisions that lead to catastrophe and regret. These resonate in our nuclear age, our age of bioweapons, our age of technologies that grant godlike power without godlike wisdom. Ancient warning, modern danger. Perhaps that's why these texts endure, not just as historical curiosities, not just as mythological relics, but as persistent questions about power, responsibility, purpose, relationship. Questions that don't age, don't become obsolete, keep asking themselves in every generation. The Sumerians wrote on clay because it was available, abundant, practical, but accidentally, they chose the most durable medium, more durable than papyrus, than parchment, than paper. The tablets survive, outlasting the cities that produced them, outlasting the languages that wrote them, outlasting the empires that collected them. And even now, as you listen to these words, as you rest in whatever darkness surrounds you, those tablets exist in museums, in university collections, in private hands, in storage rooms, still waiting, still speaking, still offering their ancient voices to anyone patient enough to listen. The story they tell, about gods and humans, about creation and flood, about conflict and regret, about power and its limits. That story isn't finished, isn't resolved, isn't closed. It continues in scholarship, in imagination, in wonder, in the questions we still ask ourselves about why we're here and what we're for and how we should live and what our relationship to power should be. The Anunnaki, whether real, remembered, or imagined, whether literal or symbolic or some complex mixture, they represent something enduring. The sense that we're accountable to something larger, that our lives have purpose, that power requires wisdom, that creation carries responsibility, and that understanding, written on clay 5,000 years ago, travels forward, reaches us, invites us into the same contemplation that occupied the scribes in their temples, the same wonder that moved the first person to press a reed into wet clay and try to capture thought itself. We're part of this story, this long conversation across time, these ancient voices speaking, and us listening, and perhaps someday others listening to what we say. The chain continues. Memory persists. The tablets endure. And the stars overhead, the same stars the Sumerians watched, wheel on in their ancient patterns, unchanged, patient, bearing witness to everything that rises and falls beneath them. And so we come to stillness, to the quiet that waits at the end of questions, at the end of stories, at the end of long journeys backward through time. You're here, right now, in whatever space holds you tonight. The Sumerian cities are ruins. The ziggurats are tell mounds in the desert. The marshes where the first settlements rose are different marshes now, drained and reflooded and drained again by modern politics and ancient rivers that never learned to be predictable. But you're breathing. The air moves in and out of your lungs, just as it moved through Sumerian lungs 5,000 years ago. The same oxygen, the same nitrogen, the same atmosphere that wrapped around the scribes as they pressed their reeds into clay. As they looked up from their work and saw stars rising in the east, those stars are still there, unchanged. Orion still climbs the winter sky. The Pleiades still cluster like distant lamps. Venus still blazes before dawn and after sunset, the brightest thing besides the sun and moon. The Sumerians called her Inanna. We call her Venus, but she doesn't care about names. She shines anyway. Patient, enduring. What happened to the Anunnaki? Did they exist? Did they depart? Did they ever walk between the rivers, teach the first cities, fight their final war and withdraw to heaven? We don't know, can't know. The tablets speak, but they speak in voices shaped by theology and time and translation, by cultures so different from ours that even their certainties are our mysteries. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps not everything should be known. Perhaps some questions are more valuable than their answers. Perhaps the real gift, the real inheritance from those ancient scribes, isn't the information they preserved, but the wonder they modeled. The patience, the care, the willingness to record what they observed and believed and imagined, knowing full well that clay outlasts empires, that future generations would read their words, that something of them would continue forward into unimaginable futures. We're that future now, and we're still wondering, still asking, still trying to understand what they meant, what they saw, what they preserved for us. The Anunnaki, real or imagined, literal or symbolic, created from memory or from need. They represent something universal, the human impulse to see pattern, to find meaning, to connect earth and sky, to imagine that we're not alone in an empty cosmos, that purpose exists, that something knows the larger story even when we only see fragments. Maybe that's what survives, not the specific beings described in the texts, not the particular theology of assemblies and cosmic laws, but the yearning they represent, the hope, the sense that life is more than accident, more than survival, more than the brief span between birth and death. The clay tablets endure in museums, but the real legacy is internal, in how we approach mystery, in whether we rush to certainty or rest in wonder, in whether we demand all questions be answered or allow some to remain open, like windows onto something larger. Tonight, the ruins of Ur rest under moonlight. The ziggurat, partially reconstructed by well-meaning but misguided modern work, still rises above the desert, not as it was, not as it will be, but as it is, patient, weathered, holding its silence. The trenches where archaeologists excavated are empty. The workers have gone home. The tools are stored, and the site waits for tomorrow's work, tomorrow's questions, tomorrow's careful brushing away of sand to reveal another brick, another room, another fragment of the ancient world that continues to emerge slowly, incompletely, endlessly, somewhere. Someone is copying a tablet, taking photographs of wedge marks worn nearly smooth, measuring them, recording them digitally so they'll survive even if the clay finally crumbles. The work continues. The conversation persists. New voices joining the old in trying to understand, to preserve, to carry forward. And the stars turn, slowly, so slowly, making their way across the sky as they have for billions of years, as they will for billions more, long after our questions are forgotten, long after our answers are dust. The stars will continue, patient, unchanged, bearing witness to everything beneath them. The reeds still grow in the marshes, the wind still moves across them, making them whisper, making them sway. Same sound, same movement, same life finding its way in the difficult land between rivers. The Euphrates still flows, though its course has changed. The Tigris still carries water from the mountains to the sea. The land abides, and in that continuity, in that persistence, in that patient endurance of stone and star and river and reed, perhaps there's an answer of sorts, not to the specific questions we've asked tonight, not about whether the Anunnaki were real or what the final war described, but to larger questions, deeper ones, about whether meaning exists, whether pattern can be found, whether the long human effort to understand, to record, to preserve, to pass forward, whether all of that matters. The tablets say yes. By existing, they say yes. By surviving, they say yes. By speaking still after 5,000 years, they say yes. You're part of this now, this conversation, this long wondering. You've listened to these ancient voices for hours. Let them speak their mysteries and their certainties and their careful observations. And somewhere, in the listening, something has passed forward. Some thread has been caught. Some small portion of that ancient world has touched you, and tomorrow you'll wake. You'll move through your life. You'll face whatever challenges wait, but somewhere, barely conscious perhaps, you'll carry this connection to deep time, this sense that you're part of something longer than one lifetime, that human wondering goes back thousands of years, that the questions don't end, that mystery itself is ancient, patient, enduring. The wind moves across the desert. The sand shifts, grain by grain, slowly reshaping the landscape, covering what was exposed, exposing what was covered. Patient erosion and patient revelation working together, as they always have. And somewhere, always, someone is listening, wondering, reaching backward through time to touch what came before, to hear what ancient voices whispered, to understand what we've forgotten. The night deepens, the breath slows, the questions rest in their silence, and the stars continue, wheeling, patient, unchanged, watching, witnessing, remembering what language has forgotten. The stone endures, the clay persists, the wind moves on. And in that movement, that persistence, that patient enduring, the ancient world continues, not as history, but as presence, not as answer, but as wonder. The Sumerians sleep in their dust, but something of them remains in the tablets, in the ruins, in the stories we still tell, in the questions we still ask. And tonight, in the darkness wherever you are, you've touched that something, held it for a moment, let it speak. The mystery endures, the tablets wait, the stars wheel on, and somewhere, in the stillness between thought and sleep, between knowing and wondering, between the ancient world and this present moment, everything continues, quietly, patiently, endlessly.